instead of keeping the servants idling about the house on board wages, and the house was then left in my charge, as I told you, sir, and after the servants went to the country it was my custom to live at home till Sir Horace returned, coming over 2 or 3 times a week to look over the place and make sure that everything was all right. On this morning, sir, after superintending the servants clearing up things, I went outside the house to have a final look round and to see that the locks of the front and back gates were in good working order. I was going to the back first, sir, but happening to glance about me as I walked round the house, I saw the young woman that Sir Horace had ordered me to show out of the house the night before he went to Scotland, peering out from behind one of the fir trees of the plantation in front of the house. As soon as she saw that I saw her, she beckoned to me. I would not have taken any notice of her, only I didn't want the women servants to see her. Sir Horace, I knew, would not have liked that, so I went across to her. I asked her what she wanted, and I told her it was no use her wanting to see Sir Horace, for he had gone to Scotland. "I don't want to see him," she said, as impudent as brass. "It's you I want to see, Field or Hill or whatever you call yourself now." It gave me quite a turn, I assure you, to find that this young woman knew my secret, and I turned round, apprehensive like, to make sure that none of the servants had heard her. She noticed me and she laughed. "It's all right, Hill," she said. "I'm not going to tell on you. I've just brought you a message from an old friend, Fred Birchill. He wants to see you tonight at this address." And with that she put a bit of paper into my hand. I was so upset and excited that I said I'd be there, and she went away. This Fred Birchill was a man I'd met in prison, and he was in the cell next to me. How he'd got on my tracks I had no idea, but I seemed to see all my new life falling to pieces now he knew. I tried to run straight since I served my sentence, and I knew Sir Horace would stand to me, but he couldn't afford to have any scandal about it, and I knew that if there was any possibility of my past becoming known I should have to leave his employ. And then there was my poor wife and child and this little business, sir. Nothing was known about my past here, so I determined to go and see this Birchill, sir. The address she had given me was in Westminster, and as my time was practically my own when Sir Horace wasn't home I went down that same evening, and when I got up the flight of stairs and knocked at the door it was a woman's voice that said, 'Come in.' I thought I recognised the voice. When I opened the door you can imagine my surprise when I saw the young woman to be Doris Fanning, who had had the quarrel with Sir Horace that night and had brought me the note that morning. Birchill was sitting in a corner of the room with his feet on another chair smoking a pipe. 'Come in, number 21,' he says with an unpleasant smile. 'Come in and see an old friend. Put a chair for him, Doris, and leave the room.' The girl did so, and as soon as the door was closed behind her Birchill turned round to me and burst out, 'Hill, that damned employee of yours has served me a nasty trick, but I'm going to get even with him and you're going to help me.' I was taken back at his words, but I wanted to hear more before I spoke. Then he told me that the young woman I had seen had been brutally treated by Sir Horace. She had been living in a little flat in Westminster on a monthly allowance which Sir Horace made her, but he'd suddenly cut off her allowance and she'd have to be turned out in the street to starve because she couldn't pay her rent. 'A nice thing,' said Birchill fiercely, 'for this high-placed loose liver to carry on like this with a poor innocent girl whose only fault was that she loved him too well. If I could show him up and pull him down I would. But I've done time like you, Hill. He was the judge who sentenced me, and if I tried to injure him that way my word would carry no weight. But I'll put up a job on him that'll make him sorry for the longest day he lives. And you'll help me. Sir Horace is in Scotland and you're in charge of his place. Get rid of the servants, Hill, and we'll burgle his house. We can easily do it between us." At this stage of his narrative Hill stopped and looked anxiously at his audience as though to gather some idea of their feelings before he proceeded further. But Inspector Chippenfield, with a fierce stare, merely remarked, "And you consented?" "I didn't at first," Hill retorted earnestly, "but when I refused he threatened me threatened that he'd expose me and drag me and my wife and child down to poverty. I pleaded with him, but it was of no use, and at last I had to consent. I had some hope that in doing so I might find an opportunity to warn Sir Horace, but Birchill did not give me a chance. He insisted that the burglary should take place without delay. All I was to do was to give him a plan of the house, explain where to find most valuable articles that had been left there, and wait for him at the flat while he committed the burglary. His idea in making me wait for him at the flat was to make sure that I didn't play him false, put the double on him, as he called it, and he told the girl not to let me out of her sight till he came back. If anything went wrong I should have to pay for it when he came back. In accordance with Sir Horace's instructions I sent the servants off to his country estate. It had been arranged that Birchill was to wait for me to come over to the flat on the 18th of August, the night fixed for the burglary, but about 7 o'clock, while I was at Riversbrook, I heard the noise of wheels outside, and looking out I saw to my dismay Sir Horace getting out of a taxi cab with a suit case in his hand. My first impulse was to tell him everything. Indeed, I think that if I had had a chance I would have. But he came in looking very severe, and without saying a word about why he had returned from Scotland, said very sharply, "Hill, have the servants been sent down to the country as I directed?" I told him that they had. "Very good," he said. "Then you go away at once. I won't want you any more. I want the house to myself tonight." "Sir Horace," I began, trembling a little, but he stopped me. "Go immediately," he said. "Don't stand there." And he said it in such a tone that I was glad to go. There was something in his look that frightened me that night. I got across to Birchill's place and found him and the girl waiting for me. I told him what had happened and begged him to give up the idea of the burglary. But he'd been drinking heavily and was in a nasty mood. First he said I'd been playing him false and had warned Sir Horace, but when I assured him that I hadn't, he insisted on going to commit the burglary just the same. With that he pulled out a revolver from his pocket and swore with an oath that he'd put a bullet through me when he came back if I'd played him false and put Sir Horace on his guard, and that he'd put a bullet in the old scoundrel, meaning Sir Horace, if he interrupted him while he was robbing the house. He sat there, cursing and drinking till he fell asleep, with his head on the table, snoring. I sat there not daring to breathe, hoping he'd sleep till morning. But Miss Fanning woke him up about 9 and he staggered to his feet to get out, with his revolver stuck in his coat pocket. He was away over 3 hours, and the girl and I sat there without saying a word, just looking at each other and waiting for a clock on the mantelpiece to chime the quarters. It was a cuckoo clock, and it had just chimed 12 when we heard a quick step coming upstairs to the flat. The girl fixed her big dark eyes inquiringly on me, and then we heard a hoarse whisper through the keyhole telling us to open the door. The girl ran to the door and let him in, but she shrieked at the sight of him when she saw him in the light, for he looked ghastly and there was a spot of blood on his face and his hands were smeared with it. He was shaking all over, and he went to the whisky bottle and drained the drop of spirit he'd left in it. Then he turned to us and said, "Sir Horace Fewbanks is dead, murdered." I suppose he read what he saw in our eyes, for he burst out angrily, "Don't stand there staring at me like a pair of damned fools. You don't think I did it. As God's my judge, I never did it. He was dead and stiff when I got there." Then he told us his story of what had happened.